Hello. Another super hot couple days, so I retreated to my air-conditioned office. So weird being here without anybody around. It's very strange. Anyway, to wrap up ecology, we are going to be talking about human impacts and a little bit about conservation. And I think I'm just going to go for it and do it all in one video. We'll see. We'll see how long it ends up being. Before we get into that, actually, there's one last thing that I wanted to mention. Sorry, my kid did the temporary tattoos again. One last thing that I wanted to mention before we move on to that, and that is the concept of succession. And I'm talking about it now because I didn't know where else to put it. So succession is kind of a ecosystem ecology topic, but it's also appropriate when we talk about human impacts because, you know, a lot of that kind of goes hand in hand. So this is where we stuck it. Okay. So succession is the change in an ecosystem over time. So species composition. Okay. There's two types of succession. There's primary succession and there's secondary succession. And so this little infographic kind of spells that out in a lot of detail, and we'll look at a couple of examples. Essentially, the difference between the two is when entirely new habitat is created, or when some sort of disturbance, that's what we call it when, you know, things go crazy. Some sort of disturbance is so dramatic that there's literally nothing left, right? There's no soil, there's nothing that's alive, right? It's just like bare rock, essentially. Those two conditions produce primary succession, right? So the initial beginnings of not just life coming to an area, but even like the buildup of soil, right? That's primary succession. Secondary succession is, as it says in this little infographic, it's basically like primary succession, but with a head start. So secondary succession occurs when a community has been disturbed, you know, significantly disturbed, but not to the extent that there's nothing, right? So often there's some soil, there's at least some seeds in the soil, if not, you know, a certain amount of plants, okay? So anyway, so we're going to talk about the types of conditions that can cause each of these and talk about a few different examples. Succession is this process of change, right? And so what's interesting is depending on what kind of habitat you're looking at, this is quite different, how this looks, the details of how this looks, okay? And as textbooks often do that are meant for the US, the examples are almost always the, you know, kind of forests of the eastern US or the mountains. They very rarely use examples that are not forests in things like this. So do with that what you will. Our kind of habitat is not often used as an example, which I'm not bitter. I'm not bitter. Who's bitter? It's not me. I'm not bitter. Anyway. Okay, so what kinds of conditions could cause primary succession? What kinds of conditions could cause a scrubbing of the earth so severely that there is not even soil left behind? One is the retreat of glaciers, right? So glaciers are huge sheets of ice that cover large areas of land. And throughout the history of the earth, there have been a variety of, you know, a bunch of ice ages, right? So there's an ice age where the glaciers come, you know, it gets cold. The glaciers come down pretty far, and then it warms up and the glaciers melt and retreat. And then they, so every time a glacier retreats, that sheet of ice was covering the land for potentially thousands and thousands of years, okay, or more. And so there's nothing that's survived underneath the ice, right? And when all of that water melts, it basically like rinses the rock clean, right? So there's nothing, there's no like organic material, there's no life in remaining, right? And so primary succession, at least to start with, is incredibly slow because first you have to have some buildup of organic material. And so you get these little tiny little plants to start with, things that can live in very little soil, and then they die, and that contributes to sort of building up the soil, right? And then, you know, you can start to get a little bit bigger plants, and then eventually you get what we call the climax community, which is essentially like a stable, I don't want to say that it's like the final community, but it's like the, assuming that there isn't another disturbance anytime soon, it's kind of like a stable community that's not really changing much, okay? Once again, how this occurs varies depending on the habitat we're talking about and, you know, different examples. So another fantastic example of primary succession. So glacier retreat is one. Another really good one is volcanic eruptions. And so we're going to talk about Mount St. Helens because your book talks about that, and it's, you know, a little more local. But another kind of really extreme example would be to think about the Hawaiian Islands. So where did the Hawaiian Islands come from? Right? How did the islands come to be? Well, there was an underwater volcano. So there was no land at all. There was an underwater volcano. It erupted. Enough lava came out that it poked out of the water. Kept going, build up, things moved in, right? So the Hawaiian Islands and lots of other, you know, Pacific islands are great examples of islands that are produced through volcanic activity. So there was literally not even rock before, and then there's land, and, you know, succession happens. So most of you are too young for this. I'm even too young for this. I was alive when Mount St. Helens erupted, but I was a baby, so I don't know. So Mount St. Helens is a volcanic mountain, right? It is a volcano in Washington State. And in 1980, that sucker blew its top, right? And so you can see the crater there, yeah. And you know, my understanding was the amount of ash that was produced from that event was pretty substantial. You know, I was living on the East Coast at the time, and I was a baby, so I don't remember. But it was a pretty big deal, right? And so, and there was, you know, lava flow too. Like it was, you know, full on eruption. Okay, and so primary succession, right? The landscape dramatically changed, right? It was now completely submerged in new rock, right? Solid lava that has cooled, right? Or layers and layers and layers of ash. And so primary succession had to occur. And now we can look at it and we can sort of see where we are in succession. So this picture is, you know, 31 years later. Now we're looking at 40 years later, right? And you can see that there's a lot more life, yeah, but we're still not quite to where, you know, a climax community would be either. Okay, so that's primary succession. What kind of succession are you looking at here, and how do you know? Why do these rocks look swirly? Right, so that's lava rock, right? It was formed by cooling lava. And so definitely an example of primary succession, yeah? Anyway, so there's some little lichens on here and some little tiny plants that have managed to get a foothold in there, okay? How about this one? So this is an image of Yellowstone National Park, which is like in the corner of Wyoming. And I actually went there the year after when I was a kid, the year after they had these really big fires in the national park. And I remember it looking like this, right? So real big, like substantial forest fire that burned a lot of the park. So what kind of succession are we looking at here? So we're looking at secondary succession, because even though fire kills everything and burns up a lot of stuff, there's still soil. There's often seeds in the soil. In fact, some of those seeds require the high heat of a fire to germinate. So there are many plant communities that are actually dependent on fire in order for, you know, them to kind of be rejuvenated and recycle. So secondary succession, okay? And so you can see that it happens a little faster, right? Because there's already soil and there's seeds and there's nearby stuff that's alive. It, you know, it kind of, it comes back a little bit quicker, okay? So anyway. So that's succession. All right. So make sure you know some examples of the two different types. Okay. So now we are transitioning to human impacts. And this is honestly, this is my least favorite section to talk about because it just makes me feel so like doom and gloom and depressed. Right. And so I try really hard. This, you know, this is a personality flaw of mine that sometimes I struggle with like seeing all of the opportunities to improve and get kind of bogged down in all of the, you know, negative things. So we are going to work really hard to keep that kind of positive, right, growth mindset that humans can do better than we have in the past. Okay. So what is the risk of organisms and habitats for being impacted by human activities? It really varies, right? And so one of the things that I think is kind of interesting about this conversation is that people get, you know, like anything else, extreme examples, right? Well, human activities don't affect X habitat at all, right? Or they, you know, impact this other habitat tremendously, right? And so there's lots of variation that affects how much of a big deal human activities are. So when we are talking about species that are, you know, have extensive geographic range, human activities are much less likely to impact them because they can, you know, move around, right? They can, if it goes extinct in one small area, it's still in this other area, right? So many species that are endangered, that's part of the reason why they're endangered, right? Is because to begin with, they didn't have a huge range, okay? So this is a picture of Australia. This little island down here is Tasmania. Ah, sorry. Right. And so a species that is found only on Tasmania is going to have, is going to be in much more, it's going to be much more vulnerable than something that lives all throughout the continent of Australia, including, you know, Southeast Asia and, you know, yada, yada. Okay. So if you need an example, Tasmanian devil is a good example. Tasmanian devils are weird little creatures, and they're currently incredibly threatened because they have this like creepy virus that like it's like the it's similar to the virus that produces warts, but it's like cancerous, and so they're all spreading it to each other, and because their population is small to begin with, because they only naturally live in this one place, they're just getting their butts handed to them, and it's pretty sad, right? Once again, population size is going to affect how much, so not just location are they restricted, but also if the population is big or small, that's going to increase risk. And then how flexible they are with habitat tolerance. So remember that last week we were talking about how sometimes species can change their niche, they can expand their niche, right? So when we were talking about the barnacles, the idea that one of those species was able to live in a drier place, the other one was not. Okay, so some species are able to, you know, just they have more tolerance to live in sort of broader diversity of habitats. And so a good example of that would be when we look at examples of animals that are moving as a result of climate change. So we have a lot of animals that we're already seeing changes in migration patterns and changes in range where they live as a result of the climate getting warmer. Okay, so if you've got a wide range of habitat tolerance, you're less likely to be negatively affected by human behaviors than if you have a very narrow, specific tolerance. Okay. All right. So what are all the bad things that people do? Here's the list. All right. So one is just straight up habitat destruction. So what does that mean? It can mean all kinds of different things. And so mostly I just kind of want to show you some pictures of some examples. This is an image of a process called strip mining. So there's lots of different ways of mining, but one of the ways that certain minerals are removed from the ground is literally, strip mining is literally where you like scrape everything off and process it and then keep scraping and keep scraping and keep, right? So you're essentially like digging a giant hole to get what you want. Obviously, that is hugely destructive to a habitat. It's the worst kind of mining that you can have, right? Because it just destroys large areas of habitat. And quite frankly, like, how do you fix that? What are you going to do to, like, rehab? Fill it in, get some, topsoil, and anyway, so that's pretty damaging. There is a type of agriculture that is called swidden agriculture. You don't need to know that name necessarily, but what it means is that basically people take forested areas and they cut everything down or burn everything in order to grow plants. Okay. I gotta pause because my phone's ringing. Well, that was worth pausing. I just got some good news. Anyway, Swidden agriculture. So basically you have forested areas, people chop down the trees and then they burn it, right? And so this is really unfortunate because not only does it mean that you're not even using the trees that you cut down to build or whatever, but it's typically done in places like the rainforest, right? So in tropical rainforests, one of the characteristics you'll be learning about this week about tropical rainforests is that their soil is incredibly poor, right? So it doesn't have a lot of nutrients in it. And the topsoil is very, very thin. And so one of the problems with trying to farm in a location like that is that you can't grow crops for very long in that thin topsoil before it's completely depleted and you just can't grow anything there, right? You also end up with all these erosion problems because there's no topsoil and now there's no tree roots to like hold what soil there is in place, that basically all of this destruction only gets a couple of growing seasons, 2-3 growing seasons out of it, right? So you've essentially cut down forests that, has trees that are potentially, 100 years old, only to grow for a year or two, okay? Now, one of the things that I always like to just kind of have in the back of your mind is that some of these problems are easier to solve than others, right? So one example here with this particular type of agriculture is you have to realize that the people who are doing this, right, aren't doing it because, they hate nature, right? We're talking about often people that are incredibly poor, yeah, and they don't have any, I shouldn't say any, they don't have very many options for ways to make a living. And so it's like, this is something that they can do. And even if they only get a couple years out of it, it's something, right? And so one of the important things I think to just kind of have in the back of your mind is that there's always a cost benefit, right? There's always, it's not always black and white, right? So Swidden agriculture is a terrible way of growing crops, terrible, right? But if that's what keeps your family alive, that's what you're going to pick, right? So so solving problems like this often involve not simply banning a practice, but coming up with an alternative, right? So acknowledging the source of the problem to begin with, and then working to figure out a solution. Okay, so for example, perhaps one way of dealing with a problem like this is saying to people, okay, so you have this area of land, rather than burn it, what if you can use it to, you know, develop ecotourist opportunities, right? What other opportunities can you do that would work for both you and the environment, right? So that's just something to think about. And I always like to think of this example because it just seems like such an awful, awful thing. But, you know, the motivation isn't necessarily evil. Yeah. Okay. And so here's an example in Brazil, right? So this is from logging, right? And so, you know, this is only 26 years. This isn't that much time that's passing. And so this is a map of the exact same area, right? And so in 1975, remote region of the forest, completely intact, right? Very little roads or any, I mean, you can see like a little, you can see a little line here, but you know, nothing essentially. And then, you know, 26 years later, right? Look at all the roads, right? So anyway, so human, so not so much for agriculture per se, but human housing, right? Human development, okay, is another big one. This might look familiar, or it might not. I don't know. It depends on how good of an eye you have for maps. This is Las Vegas, right? And so in the 70s, right, and before, there was nothing around Las Vegas. It was like the Strip, you know, a couple little things around there, but it was like there was nothing there, right? Because it's smack in the middle of the desert. And now it is incredibly populated, right? So not just Las Vegas itself, but there's all these like surrounding cities where people have come in and change the desert habitat into something that is more appealing to us, which means grass, right? Which is much more water intensive, right? Which, you know, removes species that are desert species, and you know, uses a lot more water because you can't grow grass in the desert unless you have a lot of water, right? And so that's just kind of a really interesting side-by-side comparison. Once again, not that long. I mean, you know, 40 years, but you know, it's pretty substantial growth in a relatively short period of time. Okay. All right. So there's a lot of deforestation that is happening worldwide. One of the places that it's most concern is tropical rainforests. Partly because it's a very productive and unique ecosystem. In fact, mostly because it's a very productive and unique ecosystem. And so you can see that there's a lot of loss, right, in tropical rainforest that has been modified, has been turned into other things. Okay. All right. Okay. So habitat destruction. Right? So the first big bad thing that humans do is habitat destruction. The second one that we're going to talk about is introduced species. So people use, all kinds of names for this. We say introduced, we say exotic. We say invasive species. That all means the same thing, right? And so you have read about this, I think, a little bit already. And also there were some questions about this in the homework that you already completed. So you've been exposed to a little bit of this idea already. Basically, exotic or invasive species are problematic because when you move one species to another area, until you do it, you don't know exactly what the outcome is going to be. And when you move a species from one place to another, you don't know how it's going to interact with the other living things that are there. Okay, so these are a few examples, and I'm going to talk about some other ones in more detail that are my favorites, my faves. Okay, so you know, read these if you're interested in this, because I find a lot of these stories to be bizarre and charming and weird. Okay. But I'm not going to talk about all of them because I just can't bring myself to take them out of the PowerPoint is what I'm saying. Okay. So I am going to talk about zebra mussels because zebra mussels are pretty funny. So zebra mussels, here's another picture of zebra mussels. And so zebra mussels are a little bivalve, like a, you know, like the kind of mussel you eat. Okay. And they're a freshwater animal, and they likely were introduced into the Great Lakes through ballast in a ship. So, not to go into the weeds too much about seafaring, but when you have large cargo ships and they're full of cargo, right? They get real heavy and they kind of sit really low in the water, right? If they're empty, they don't have any cargo, they have a tendency to like be really high on the water, and they, you know, it's kind of dangerous, right? It's more likely to like flip over or something if it's like real high up on the water. And so what large ships do is when they're empty of cargo, they have these chambers essentially inside of the ship where they suck up water that the boat is sitting in to kind of make them heavier and more stable. Yeah. And so they call that ballast. And so typically when a boat is going from one place to another, either picking up cargo or dropping off cargo, they just are picking up and dropping off ballast water wherever they're picking up or dropping off their cargo. Yeah. And so likely some zebra mussels got sucked into some ballast water, and then the boat that sucked them up went to the Great Lakes in the north, they want to call it the Midwest, but it's Mid-East, right? But you know, the Great Lakes, they you know, got introduced there. Okay, and that's probably where they came from. The interesting thing about zebra mussels is that where they're from, they don't cause problems. They're not super abundant, right? Because where they live, there are predators that keep them in control. There might also be diseases that keep their population in control. So remember the conversation we had last time about keystone predators, right? So there are things that keep their population under control. But in the Great Lakes, there is no such predator, right? There is not an organism that keeps zebra mussels under control. As a result of that, they are growing like crazy all over the place in the Great Lakes. And that's a problem ecologically because they are fierce competitors. Mussels are real tough little suckers, right? They're fierce competitors, so they displace other species, which, you know, screws up the food webs, right, of all of the, you know, organisms in those lakes. And then they also cause a lot of problems for humans because they grow so much. They tend to grow all over everything, and they like fill in stuff. So they fill in sewer pipes and drain pipes. They cover anything that ends up under the water. So this picture is kind of a fun picture of a shopping cart that, you know, ended up in one of the lakes, and it just, you know, right, they just grew all over it. Yeah. And so so they're nasty little things, and they're super hard to get rid of because they're so so abundant, because they're so very successful. Okay, so that would be an example of an unintentional introduction, right? Nobody intentionally brought zebra mussels here. They just ended up here because of human activity, right? But it wasn't on purpose. Okay, I might come back to that. Oh, okay, I'm gonna talk about it. I can't stop with the ant example, so I'm gonna talk about it. So what you're looking at in this picture is you're looking at two different species of ants. You're looking at these little kind of more black colored ones. They're kind of brownish, but whatever. The darker colored ones, and you're looking at this big red one. So this big red one, she is a harvester ant. And the way that you can tell, or at least the way that I can tell, because I do ants, is she's got a beard. So do you see all that, like, it almost looks like fur, like around underneath her jaw? Yeah. That is very characteristic of harvester ants. Okay. And so she's got this beard. Harvester ants are one of the species of our local native ants, right? They live around here. They're really important for our ecosystem because other organisms depend on them as a food source. Lots of lizards actually eat them. And they also play a really important role in moving the seeds around for all kinds of different shrubs and plants, right? So they play a really important role in our local ecosystem, okay? Well, a few decades ago, likely in a potted plant from a nursery, some ants, a species of ant that is originally from Argentina, were introduced into the US. And Argentine ants, as we often call them, is their common name because that's where they're from. Argentine ants, if you have ants in your house, it's probably them, right? Argentine ants in our local area have essentially completely displaced all of our native ants. It used to be 50 years ago that you could have any number of different species of ants that live in your yard, right? But now, for the most part, most of us, the only ants we have in our yard or in our house in this area are these Argentine ants. Also fire ants, that's another one, imported fire ants, that's another one that also is invasive, okay? Those two species can live places that are wet. So the only places where native ants still live are places that are not irrigated. So nature, right? So just saying, right? Ah! Dropping my computer. That was a good squawky noise. Sorry, I get excited when I talk about ants. All right, well, I'm gonna skip some examples. In your book and in your homework, they talk about lionfish. In your homework, there's a great little video about these guys and how totally screwed up they are. It's pretty impressive, right? Some other examples so all of those examples, well, this is somewhat intentional because it's people dumping their pets basically. But all of these other examples are things that are not intentional, right? Like nobody intentionally put zebra mussels there. Nobody intentionally brought ants from Argentina. They just, found themselves here. All kinds of parrots, like the parrots that live in Pasadena. And actually, they come visit my house pretty regularly. They're really spreading out now. They used to just live in Pasadena, but there's all kinds of feral parrot colonies that have escaped just, from people's, their pets, right, that escaped and found love out in nature and enjoy our mild climate and do what birds do and make baby birds. Okay, another fun example, this is a plant called kudzu, and kudzu is from Japan, and it's a vine, and kudzu is an example of an intentional introduction. So kudzu was brought over to the US, particularly the southeastern US, so Georgia, like that area, and they brought it over as a solution for erosion control. So when you do construction or you remove trees or whatever, if you live in a place that's real rainy, then the rain washes the dirt away if there's no roots to hold the dirt in place. And so kudzu was installed for erosion control purposes. Turns out, though, that it grows like crazy and it's completely out of control in Georgia. So it grows all over everything. And it is so successful there that, once again, it doesn't have natural predators. Right? It's not the habitat here is different than it is in Japan. So it's not kept in check here. And so it grows all over everything. And so trees die because the kudzu literally like consumes them. The kudzu grows over top of them. It's so fast growing that it grows over top of them so that they can no longer photosynthesize. And it basically drowns them essentially, right? It just like completely blocks them from the sun. It's terrible. Right? So that was a bad move. That was I think I have a solution, and that turned out not to do what we wanted it to do. I mean, it does, erosion control, but the trade-off is not worth it. Okay. And this one's just a funny, like, stupid story. So The European starling is a bird that, as the name implies, is from Europe and hugely invasive. And it is now currently all over, I think, basically like all of North America, definitely the US. Okay. But I believe it's even in like Southern Canada and Northern Mexico as well. The European starling, the way that it got to the US is, 100 years ago, there was a group of Shakespeare lovers that thought, wouldn't it be charming if we got a pair of every type of bird that is mentioned in Shakespeare's body of work, right? So all of his plays and sonnets and whatever, we're going to go to Europe and we're going to collect a male and a female. It's like a demented Noah's Ark situation, right? We're going to collect all these birds and we're going to bring them here and we're going to put them in Central Park for the public to enjoy. Central Park in New York City, right? For the public to enjoy. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Well, some of the species didn't make it, right? Because different habitat, they couldn't hang. Some of them, probably have descendants there now. The European starling, it turned out, is so incredibly successful and invasive here that over the course of less than 100 years, it made it from New York City all the way across the entire US to the West Coast, right? And so we have starlings now. And whenever I see one, I threaten to shoot them. I do the same with Argentine ants, by the way. I swear and cuss and holler at them whenever I see them. Anyway, right? Normally I am not interested in murdering things that are alive. I'm one of those people that will like catch a spider in my house and take it outside to let it go. Not that way with Argentine ants. They don't belong here. Anyway, so that's another good one, right? One of the reasons that we occasionally introduce species is for something called biological control. And so I actually mentioned this in the last video. I talked about this example of, not in the last video, but a couple videos ago. Sorry, guys. I talked about how ladybugs are amazing predators of aphids. So biological control, on the face of it, sounds like an amazing idea, right? So you've got some sort of problem, you bring in a predator to take care of the problem, and it's natural and you don't have to use chemicals, and wouldn't that be fantastic? Sometimes biological control goes wrong though, right? So so these are cane toads, and cane toads were brought to Australia as a biological control, as a natural solution to help get rid of bugs, right? That were agricultural pests. But it turns out cane toads, which are not native to Australia, do very well in Australia. And their populations are so out of control that you can see they're all over this road. And so people are just driving down the road and just like squishing toads everywhere. Because there's just, millions upon millions of them. And they're a nuisance and they're a mess, right? All over the place, okay? So, bad news there. Okay. And there's other examples too. So there's other examples in your book. There's other examples in your homework. So the takeaway there is, it would be nice if you have in your pocket, right? And by your pocket, I mean your brain, a couple of examples of introduced species that are unintentional. So like accidental introduction, and some that are intentional, right? And so if it was intentional, what was the thinking, and what is the outcome? What are the problems that have come as a result of them being introduced? Okay, so anyway, so introduced species. So we talked about habitat destruction. We talked about introduced species. Next, we shall talk about overexploitation. Okay, so overexploitation is when we fail to appropriately manage our natural resources, if we put that in kind of general terms. So this picture is actually really interesting because at first it's like, I don't know what I'm looking at, right? I'm seeing these white things. They kind of look like overgrown footballs. What is happening here? So this is an example of overfishing. And so these are tuna, believe it or not. Likely they are bluefin tuna. Bluefin tuna are incredibly, they're struggling, right? And the reason that they're struggling is that they're incredibly popular and apparently tasty in sushi, right? And so this is a Japanese fish market. And basically what happens with tuna specifically, but with any kind of like sushi grade, super high quality sushi grade fish, they have these, what am I trying to say? Auctions, right? They have these auctions where, you know, the fishermen bring the fish and they, you know, the reason they look like weird footballs is because they've gutted them and they've cut off the tails. They've cut off the parts that aren't useful. They've added tags so they know who the fisherman is so that they can pay, you know, the right person, right? And essentially they have these auctions where people will pay sometimes hundreds of dollars a pound, right, for really good bluefin tuna. So the problem with that is, once again, this idea of like, you know, well, why would we want to kill all the tuna? Why would we do such a thing? Right? Well, if you're a fisherman and you know that you can make, you know, if you get a, I don't know, a 40-pound tuna and you know that you can make thousands of dollars on that tuna, what are you going to choose to fish? Right? It's kind of a no-brainer. Yeah. Right. And so over exploitation is a thing. And so I did talk about this a little bit. We talked about fisheries management before when we were talking about populations. But this is a problem with fishing, with hunting, even harvesting plants potentially, right? So I'm not going to talk about fishery collapsing again, but that's an important example. One other example I will talk about, just because I have really, you know, firsthand knowledge of, is it is possible often to responsibly manage particularly sea life. That's the example I'm going to talk about, but other resources as well, so that they continue to exist, right? So my husband thinks he's funny when he jokes around about, you know, whenever he eats bluefin tuna, he makes a crack about how he can't wait to tell his grandchildren about how good bluefin tuna tasted, because by the time we have grandchildren, bluefin tuna will be extinct. And I always get really mad at him when he says that. And I think that's why he does it, just to piss me off. Anyway, marriage dynamics aside. When I was in college, I worked at a fish market in the summers. I'm pretty sure I told you guys that. And we sold a lot of lobster, right? So Massachusetts, much like Maine, is a place where there's a lot of lobsters being sold. And lobster is an excellent, Maine lobster is an excellent example of a well-managed population, okay? There are regulations in place that protect lobster enough so that the population doesn't crash, but also allows people to harvest a lot of lobster, to catch a lot of lobster, right? And you know, make a living doing that. All right. And so if any of you have ever watched The Deadliest Catch, is it on the History Channel? Is that what channel it was on? Anyway, I don't watch TV anymore because, anyway, I'm not allowed to because my children have to watch stupid crap all the time. Don't have kids. Anyway, so you would, you know, you'd see them checking the size, right, of crabs that they would catch. Same thing with lobster, right? So when a lobsterman catches a lobster, they get their, you know, pot full of lobsters. They have to measure them and make sure that they are above a certain size. The reason they do that is they want to make sure that those lobsters are adults. Why do you think you would want to limit capture to only adults? Why would you want to prevent people from catching juvenile lobsters or crabs or whatever? Why would you do that? Right? So the idea is that if they're adults over a certain size, it's likely that they've probably reproduced once or twice, hopefully, maybe more than that. Yeah. And so the idea is that you know, left them in the ocean long enough to replace themselves. Yeah. Before you kill them. Right. So, there's a lot of fish that are managed this way. So a lot of fish, there's size limits, right? In order to, you know, legally catch this fish, it has to be, you know, 30 inches long, for example, because they're looking for it to be of an adult size where it hopefully has reproduced, right? There are also, in the case of lobsters, there's also rules about if a female lobsters carry their eggs on the inside of their tail. And so if you catch a female lobster that has eggs on her tail, you have to let her go. And so one of my favorite memories of working at the fish market, so we had all these, we were literally on the ocean, like literally right on the beach, essentially. The fish market was at the fish pier where the boats came in to drop off the fish. And so we had seawater that filtered through our tanks where we kept our lobsters, right? So we had, you know, like 10 different big, giant like tanks and just seawater filtered through. And so one time, this only happened once when I was working there, because for the most part, you know, everybody was really careful. But one time, our boss reached in the lobster tank to, you know, sell a lobster to somebody, and he, you know, picked her up and looked at her, and she had eggs on her tail. And it probably was that she didn't have eggs on her tail when we bought her, right? When the fisherman sold her to the fish market, right? She probably laid her eggs in the tank, right? And so he was like, all right, guys, we got to let this one go. And so we're all, you know, like the local kids in high school, you know, the other kids I worked with, some of them were in college, some of them were in high school, the locals were in high school. And so, you know, all the kids that were working there, we all like, we were super excited. So we all went outside, and, you know, a couple of the boys took the rubber bands off her claws. We keep rubber bands on their claws so they don't pinch you, right? So they took the rubber bands off her claws, and then we set her free. It was very exciting. And I'm sure she, you know, I don't know if she actually made it or not, but whatever, it was fun. Okay. So there are ways to manage without over exploitation. We just have to think about how to do that responsibly, right? So that, once again, we have this balance of people still being able to make a living, right? And people still being able to enjoy, you know, these things, right? Without completely, you know, collapsing the populations. Okay. Another screwed up thing that people do is pollution. That's pretty straightforward. I don't want to belabor this point, but there's all kinds of, when you burn anything, particularly fossil fuels, but when you burn anything, right, you produce all kinds of gases in particulate matter that's really nasty. So the one that people talk about the most now is carbon dioxide, but that's not the only one that's bad, right? There's all kinds of other sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and other things that, when combined with water in the atmosphere, in the clouds, turn to acid, and you end up with acid rain. So here's a fun picture of the effects of acid rain and acid fog. It's not fun, right? There's also images, if you Google it, you can see images of statues, like marble statues, that have been affected by acid rain and acid fog, because marble is really sensitive, is really reactive to acid. And so you can see these statues where basically the faces have sort of like melted off because of just exposure to acid, right? So that's not good for living things, right? And then the biggie, of course, the one that we always want to talk about. I'm just trying to see where we are. Is climate change. Okay, so the term that we use to describe this now is climate change. Previously, people used global warming or the greenhouse effect. The reason that the name has changed is that it's the overall effect of global climate change is warming, right? But it's not sort of evenly spread necessarily. And so the real harm in this change in the climate is that it's changing, right? So hence the name. originally we called this phenomenon the greenhouse effect. And the greenhouse effect is illustrated in this picture. And here's a little picture of a greenhouse to help you understand that, okay? The greenhouse effect is interesting because the greenhouse effect is actually one of the reasons why Earth is a habitable place for life to begin with, right? So we actually need the greenhouse effect. Otherwise, if we didn't have any greenhouse effect at all, at night, the Earth would be like way below freezing, super duper 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 cold. And during the day, it would be super duper duper hot, right? And so there'd be huge temperature swings, right? And Earth would be too cold to support life, at least the way that we know it, right? Certainly us, it would be too cold to support us. So a certain amount of the greenhouse effect is actually good. The problem is when it gets out of control. Okay, so let's talk about what it is exactly. So, you know, the primary driving force that keeps Earth toasty warm is solar energy, right? So solar energy comes down from the sun, right? Goes through, I keep hitting the button, comes down, right? Through our atmosphere and hits the Earth. And a lot of that is radiated back out, right? Or back up towards the atmosphere. Some of that escapes through the atmosphere. Some of it does not, okay? And so some of it escapes, but a lot of it is just reflected back down. How much is reflected back down depends on the makeup of our atmosphere. And so there are certain gases that we've, you know, coined the term greenhouse gases that act like a little barrier here that essentially keep more of the heat inside instead of letting it out. Like I said, a certain amount of this is important because without it, we'd be a frozen ball. Okay. But too much, and we retain too much heat. It's like insulation. Okay. And so they call it the greenhouse effect because this is how greenhouses are designed to work. Okay. So if you've lived in California your whole life, you are not familiar with this idea probably because we don't have very many greenhouses because it's so warm here. So we can grow almost anything outside in Southern California. But if you were to visit, let's say, a botanic garden in Wisconsin, I don't know why I'm picking on Wisconsin, but there it is. And you wanted to see their tropical plant collection in Wisconsin. Well, that stuff can't live outside in Wisconsin because the winter would kill it. So they keep it in a greenhouse. And what a greenhouse is basically, traditionally they were made of glass, but they can be made of other materials. And the idea is that they absorb a ton of heat from the sun, but then the glass, while the sunlight can get in, the glass provides a certain amount of insulation so the heat can't get out as quickly. So it's basically a way of allowing the plants to get light so they can photosynthesize, but also helping to keep them toasty warm. Okay, so that's why we call it the greenhouse effect, because it works the same way as a greenhouse. Now, what are the greenhouse gases? The one that people talk about the most, because it has the biggest impact, is carbon dioxide, but there are other greenhouse gases as well. There are other gases in our atmosphere that cause it, that cause the greenhouse effect. So one of them is methane, right? Methane is popular because one of the significant sources of methane is cow farts. So that's why the cows are in this picture. Right? So combustion of fossil fuels produces a lot of greenhouse gases, including, you know, one of which is carbon dioxide, as do livestock and humans, right? We exhale carbon dioxide all the time. Okay. One of the things that's important to realize about this is that a certain amount of carbon dioxide, because remember last time we were talking about how chemicals cycle, right? So energy flows, chemicals cycle, right? So the carbon and oxygen that are found in carbon dioxide absolutely cycle through the ecosystem. The problem is when that source of carbon dioxide is from fossil fuels, what ends up happening is you end up putting more carbon dioxide into the air than it's possible for photosynthetic organisms to take up. So what happens is, instead of having a cycle where it's like up, oh God, I keep hitting the button. It's making me crazy. Instead of having a cycle where it's like this arrow and this arrow are even, right? What happens is you have an overabundance of the purple arrows and not as much of the green arrows. So more carbon dioxide being produced than is being captured, okay? And the reason for that is what fossil fuels are, okay? So fossil fuels include natural gas, coal, crude oil, which we use to make gasoline and other kerosene and other things, okay? Propane, all that kind of stuff. Fossil fuels, in their name, tells you what they are, okay? So the way that fossil fuels were created hundreds of millions of years ago is there were these in the Carboniferous period, okay? There were these huge, do you like that? A little bit of my paleontology sneaking out. There were these huge forests, absolutely huge. It was a really warm period in Earth's history. It was really warm and moist, and there was a lot of just plant. It was a great time to be a plant. And so there were just huge forests all over the place. And what's especially interesting about that time is that those plants, when they died, did not decompose as efficiently as they do now, okay? Because now we have organisms, we have fungi primarily, that are capable of breaking down all of the components that make up plant material. But back then, those enzymes that are used to break down a particular type of plant chemical called lignin, you don't need to know that, those enzymes didn't yet exist. They had not evolved. And so the plant material, instead of decomposing, when the trees would die or lose their leaves or whatever, you would end up with these deep, 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 deep piles of swampy, dead plant material that wouldn't decompose. It would just keep getting buried under more plant material and more plant material and more plant material. And then over a long period of time, ultimately underground, right? Okay. And so, and this is where we find our fossil fuels, underground. Okay. So the thing about fossil fuels is the plants that were taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere when they were doing photosynthesis were doing that hundreds of millions of years ago. And it's essentially been trapped underground. And so now when we burn fossil fuels, right, instead of the carbon dioxide from those plants being photosynthesized, being used for photosynthesis by those same plants, those plants have been dead for hundreds of millions of years, which is why we end up with this net arrow of overproduction of carbon dioxide. Okay. So we produce, in burning fossil fuels, we release a ton of carbon dioxide that was, happily stored away, stashed away for, hundreds of millions of years. Okay. All right. You will see all over the place, lots of different, I'm going to use the word opinions about climate change. It's really, at this point, irrefutable. I find it incredibly frustrating when I engage with people who don't see the big picture and don't trust the science that has been done to look at how the climate is changing, and instead choose to say things like, well, it snowed. We had the worst snowstorm we've had in years. So it must be that, what's all this global warming crap about? Right? So just because, you get these great snowstorms doesn't mean that the entire planet isn't heating up, right? It just means that, you're not, that there's a weird cold front in your area. Okay? It doesn't say anything about the overall climate of the entire planet. Okay. So if we look at, and this is old data, we'll look at more recent data in a second. If we look at the amount of carbon dioxide, the concentration of carbon dioxide that's in the air, right, it has increased tremendously, right, over the last many decades. Yeah, before that it was relatively stable, right? As have, oh, I keep hitting the button, right? As have, so I'm going to pick around the same time, so 1960, right? So what we're seeing is we're seeing an increase in temperature overall. You know, there's wiggles, there's up, down, up, down, up, down, right? But what we're seeing is we're seeing a pattern, a trend of increasing temperatures that matches the increases in carbon dioxide concentration, right? And those carbon dioxide, the reason that the carbon dioxide is increasing is because we're burning ever more fossil fuels, okay? So worldwide, temperatures have gone up quite a bit, right? And, oh, I totally forgot to put it in the PowerPoint. I'm gonna have to post it on Canvas separately, but I'm gonna totally post the picture. There's this really cool graph that I saw recently, somebody posted on Twitter or something, that showed how hurricane season has been affected by climate change, right? So it's not just overall temperatures are getting warmer, right? But weather patterns are changing, right? So we're having strange weather and other climate related conditions that normally we wouldn't have as a result of this change in weather patterns. When you heat up the air, it behaves differently than if it's cool, okay? So our hurricane seasons here in the US, right? Hurricane seasons that affect people in there, yeah, are starting earlier and earlier and earlier every year, right? Much earlier. So early, in fact, this year that we went through the entire alphabet with naming the hurricanes, right? So normally we name them alphabetically. So the first one of any hurricane season gets an A name, and then the next one gets a B name, and so on and so forth, right? And we actually went through the entire alphabet. That's never happened before, okay? Or at least not in recent memory, okay? The fires that we've been having, the fact that here, right, in California and Washington and Oregon, but also in Australia, are likely very much exacerbated by high temperatures, right? Drought. The reason that we had a 30-year drought, right? And the reason that the drought is so problematic is if the trees die, guess what? Dead trees, more fuel for fires, right? So the local fires that we've been having are exacerbated by climate change, yeah? And so all of these things, there's starting to be more and more flooding problems in low-lying areas. My beloved sister lives in coastal Virginia, like literally like, I think her house is like something stupid, like, 3 miles above sea level or something stupid like that. And so I'm constantly like, yeah, you're gonna drown in a hurricane. I'm like, you need to move inland. Come on, what are you doing? And she said to me the other day, she said, we are in evacuation zone C, okay? We're not in evacuation zone A or B. We're in evacuation zone C. And I was like, yeah, well, evacuation zone M would be a lot better, wouldn't it? So, I'm just saying. And then it came out that they only go up to D. So whatever. But anyway, right? So we're going to see continued changes in severe weather, continued warming, continued record temperatures, right? It got over 130 degrees Fahrenheit in Death Valley this summer, right? Highest recorded temperature in the US, right? And so we're going to see that continuing unless we do something to rein it in. Okay. You can look at images. Now this, once again, this is really old. That's only to 2005, right? So this isn't even most recent stuff, but you can see that the ice that was on the, the polar ice cap, right, on the North Pole, is getting a lot smaller. The ice is melting, right? We can see, as I was, referencing earlier, we can see all kinds of species are changing their range, right? So on the northern hemisphere, animals are moving farther north because it's getting too hot in the south. And then the opposite is true in the southern hemisphere. Species are moving farther and farther south because it's too hot close to the equator, right? And so we are seeing the effects of climate change in all aspects, right, of nature and in human affairs as well. So this is a serious problem. Okay. And so here is a little diagram that shows now the scale here is 2,000 years, right? So this is showing the increase in concentration of I can talk, I can, of greenhouse gases, right? Okay. Yeah. Right. And so we can see that it's exponential growth, right? It's quite dramatic, right? Another big concern that goes with this is that if we continue to depend so much on fossil fuels, they will run out. They are a limited resource, right? And so we already are going to more and more extreme measures to extract them from the ground than what we used to do because they are running out, right? So fracking, if you've heard of fracking, basically what fracking is injecting like water into the ground to make like a slurry to extract fossil fuels out of soil when it's not in like pockets. So previous to this, we would only go after fossil fuels that were in large areas. So like, oh, you have a big pocket of crude oil? Cool, we'll drill down and suck that out, right? Oh, we've got a big area of coal. Okay, we'll build a mine and we'll go in and we'll, scrape that all out, remove that out. Well, now we're getting desperate enough that we're starting to extract it from soils where it's much more difficult to do, right? And environmentally damaging along the way, right? So, so for a variety of reasons, not just for, the issue of global warming, global climate change, but also just because eventually we're going to run out, we need to look at other, we need to invest in other ways of capturing energy, right? The sun is essentially a giant ball of infinite energy. It's not really infinite, but for our purposes, it is, right? And so we need to develop technology that can efficiently capture and store that. And those technologies are getting better. There's still a lot of ways to go though, right? Solar cars have come a long way. Solar panels have come a long way. Electric cars have come a long way. Because if you have solar panels, you want an electric car because then basically you're driving for free. Yeah. These technologies have come a long way, but they're still not at the level that they need to be in order for us to have that be our only source of energy. There's also geothermal energy and wind and hydroelectric and all these other renewable types of energy as well, which, I don't want to spend too much time talking about. So I'm just going to, kind of leave that there. But we really need to switch to those things for all of the reasons, not just any one reason, not just because of climate change, but also just because fossil fuels are going to become so scarce that they're going to be incredibly expensive, right? The amount of environmental damage we're doing trying to collect every last little molecule of fossil fuels is causing all kinds of damage, right? So we need to do something differently, okay? All right, so that's kind of the end of my like doom and gloom, like how we're messing up the planet speech, okay? I think I'm going to stop just because this is long, and I'm going to do a separate video on kind of the rest of this conversation. So this is part one, and then we'll do a part two.